angle landscape in telephoto. Two lenses that we're going to have on special today is the 14mm 1.8 with an additional $25 off, and a 150 to 600 contemporary with $215 discount. So be on the lookout for that, and at the end of the chat, be on the lookout for the $150 gift certificate. And I'll try my best to answer all your questions in the chat. And take it to Kristen now.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and get my screen shared.
Well, one more thing, if you all can turn off your video, it helps conserve bandwidth, and so we'll have less glitches during the presentation. So it'd be great if we all turn our videos off.
Okay, all set? Okay, I think my screen is now shared for you guys. I'm Kristen Ryan. Welcome to Wide Angle to Telephoto Landscapes, Capturing the Essence of the Scene. I am a landscape and nature photographer from outside Chicago. I live with my husband and 4 kids. And I grew up with a love for nature, often having a camera in my hand. But it wasn't until about 10 years ago or so that I really started diving into learning the intricacies of controlling the camera and the settings so that I could capture the scene in front of me as I was seeing it with my eyes. I started the presentation with this image from Grand Teton National Park because the Tetons have had a significant impact both in my life and in my photography. I've been traveling out to the Tetons many, many summers of my life since I was a little girl. My grandparents bought property and built a home there in 1969. So I really have spent my whole life heading there, and I felt that's where I really fell in love with nature, hiking those trails and falling in love with the magic of the mountains. It was also the place that I really fell in love with landscape photography, and it's had a huge impact on my photography in that way. In the fall of 2012, I took a trip all by myself without my kids and spent a weekend just exploring with my camera on the trails. And that's really, it marks a very distinct point in my photography learning and journey of when I made a real shift from just taking pictures of kind of my kids and everything to really falling in love with landscapes. I came home from that trip and kind of just really dove into learning. And within a few years, I started to teach an online landscape photography class with Click Photo School. I've been teaching that class ever since for about 6 years, twice a year. And after a few years of teaching that class and developing a really wonderful community, primarily of female photographers, I started looking for ways that I could teach and connect with people more in person. In the fall of 2017, I launched my first landscape photography retreat for women in the Tetons. And that retreat was really successful. Since then, I've added a second retreat there each year, as well as one in Chicago and Banff. I love to be out in nature, and I love to connect with others, share my passion with like-minded people, and this is really a perfect pairing for me and my photography. Landscape photography brings me into the moment. It puts aside all other thoughts except the light, the scene, and what's in my viewfinder. It's calming, meditative, and therapeutic for me in a chaotic lifestyle as a busy mom. I'm sure many of you relate to the need to get out in nature and take that moment where you can just be present with our amazing earth. So wide angle to telephoto landscapes. Today we're talking about capturing the landscape with a variety of lenses and focal lengths. When we get out into the field, we have a lot of choices to make, and the choice of lens and focal length is one of the first choices we make. I love this topic because I'm often asked my top or favorite lens for landscape photography when I'm teaching classes and people reach out with questions. And I think so often people immediately think of a wide angle lens. And I do love a wide angle lens for capturing those dramatic skies and great expansive views, but it's not always the best choice. The best choice depends on the scene and could be anywhere from 14mm to 600mm. I always carry a range of lenses in my bag, and generally I find that I use all of them to capture different scenes in different ways. So the lenses I use for the images I'm going to be sharing and talking about today are the Sigma 14 f1.8 art lens, the Sigma 24 to 70 f2.8 art lens, and the Sigma 150 to 600 millimeter f5 to 6.3 contemporary lens. And that's an awesome deal for $215 off, by the way. So Sigma offers sales through Samy's camera for these lenses and others. So today I'm going to share my thoughts on why I choose these particular lenses and focal lengths to capture a scene. Focal length choice can make a dramatic difference in the way a scene is photographed and the story that we're telling to a viewer. In addition, using a variety of lenses and focal lengths can help us create a handful of uniquely compelling images from a single location. So I hopefully at the end of the presentation, you'll feel not only inspired to think about why you might use a certain lens, but also how you might approach a particular location with more than one lens, and how the stories that you can tell with each lens are very unique and compelling in their own way. So when choosing a lens, I ask myself a question that's really important, I think, in all the choices that we make as we photograph a scene. And the question I always ask myself as I prepare to photograph is, what is it that's drawing my eye to this scene? And I think this is so important because I want my image to clearly capture the element or elements that are drawing me into the physical real life scene. I want to think about what my senses are feeling, how I am feeling inside, as well as how I'm connecting to the landscape. When I look at the image that I've captured later, I want to be brought back right to that scene, and I want it to make me feel as I did in that moment. When a viewer sees it, I want them to be feeling clear as to what the story is, and for their eye to be drawn to the story and the highlight that I was aiming to capture on that particular day. So this first image that I've shared here is at Oxbow Bend in Grand Teton National Park. This is actually blue hour. The starburst above the mountain range there is the moon. And I got there early before the sunrise. This was in the fall. And I chose to use the 14 millimeter lens because I was really in awe of the grand scene. I wanted to include a lot of the environment and the sky. You can see the little stars above. So that was the reason for using this really wide angle lens. So what is drawing my eye? Is it the expanse of the scene, a colorful or dramatic sky, a pocket of light hitting a mountaintop or group of trees, or maybe it's a pattern, texture, or shapes within the scene? And these questions that I'm thinking of how I'm connecting to the scene, what it is that's really pulling me in, is important when I'm choosing what lens I want to use. If it's an incredibly expansive view or a dramatic sky, or perhaps it's a scene with really compelling layers from near to far, then a wide angle is going to be a great choice. If it's a smaller segment of the scene or really far away from me, then I'm going to consider using a longer lens. So another question that I want to ask myself when I'm choosing my lens is, what do I want to include? And just as importantly, what do I want to exclude? It's obviously important to include the highlights and supporting elements of a scene, but excluding distracting elements can be just as important, so a viewer isn't distracted away from the story that you're trying to tell. So I'm going to start off talking about each lens individually and sharing some images and why I chose each lens to capture that particular scene. And then after, I will show some locations where I shot images with various lenses and can compare how those stories are different from one another. So the first lens that I'm going to talk about is the Sigma 14 millimeter f1.8 art lens. And this lens is a fabulous lens when you want to capture a lot of environment. It's great for capturing large objects that are close to you in the frame. For example, mountains that are really large, impressive, and close to you, such as in this scene in this frame. They're fantastic for maximizing dramatic skies, those stormy skies and beautiful sunsets and sunrises. And it's also excellent in low light and night photography. This is also a go-to lens for me when I'm shooting astrophotography. Something to consider, it can be a con, would be that it does create some distortion because it's super wide. And the other thing is that you want to consider is just that the really wide angle makes objects appear smaller than they are in real life. So looking at this image, this is also of String Lake. And on the shores of this lake, you're really close to the mountains. So in order to capture the mountains, some sky, the reflection below, and sometimes I even try to get some of the shoreline, really need a wide angle lens. That said, when I do capture them, the mountains in the image do not feel as impressive and large as they do in real life. So it's just something to keep in mind depending on what your story is. And this particular image, I loved the sky, the soft colors of the sunrise, as well as the reflection, and I wanted to capture the entire scene. Here's another image. This one's captured in Dana Point, California, and I used the Sigma 14mm in this image as well. I was really drawn to all the rocks in the foregrounds and the little puddles of water before reaching the ocean. I wanted to capture a lot of layers from very close to me all the way out into the ocean and beyond to the sunset, as well as include the tiny little moon at the top of the frame. So that's why I chose a really wide angle lens. Also, if I had used a longer lens, it likely would have chopped off the moon. And while it's not huge in the frame and it's in a large element, it still was part of my story. This is at another location in Grand Teton National Park. This was after an amazingly colorful sunset one fall evening. As I started to walk back to the car, I stopped and could tell that there was still a little bit of color that would come out in the clouds. So I shot this one for a long exposure of 30 seconds. And the long exposure of the clouds was the main story that I was trying to capture in this particular scene. And I wanted to get a great expanse of the sky. And I love this, especially the wispy clouds up at the top of the frame. So the wide angle was perfect. In addition, it also captures a nice long line from left to right towards the mountains in the frame. You can tell that the mountains are not significantly large in the frame, and that is, as mentioned previously, something that can happen in the wide angle, but it does give a lot of environment, which was the goal of my capturing this image in that particular moment. This is another vantage point at String Lake. And as I mentioned earlier, I love the 14mm lens for astrophotography. This particular night, my group and one of my retreats, we got to String Lake early, shooting the sunset, and we're planning to stay until we could capture the Milky Way. You can actually see a little hint of the Milky Way coming up on the left side of the frame. So this was blue hour, and I had my 14mm set up, and some little clouds started to come through, making us a little bit scared that they were gonna mess up our astrophotography, but they just kind of came through real quick. But I shot this at 15. I wanted to see some of the movement of the clouds. And the wide angle allowed me to capture a nice foreground of the lake, as well as a lot of sky, in addition to the mountains. So the mountains maybe are smaller than they appeared in real life, but it allows me to capture a lot of environment surrounding them. The 14mm is also a really great lens for city photography. As I mentioned earlier, I live near Chicago, And, you know, the buildings are really large, and a 14 millimeter is great for capturing the height and width and environment surrounding the city. So on this particular evening in last spring in the city, I used the 14 as I wanted to capture a lot of the river leading into the Trump Tower, both on the left and the right side of the frame. It left me just enough on the top of the frame to be comfortable. And using a longer lens would have forced me to take out some of the river, both on the right and left side of the frame. So this was a perfect choice here. I should just note that the moon was captured at the same time, but with a longer lens and composited in. Just not something I do often, but I did do for this image, just for reference. The moon was a bit smaller in the original. The 14 millimeter can also be fantastic for seascapes and beach images, especially when you have a dramatic sky. I am a sucker for dramatic skies, beautiful sunsets, and dramatic clouds. And this was captured on the shores of Oahu a couple of years ago on a spring break. And I was really drawn to the amazing clouds that were above the water. So I used the 14 here. This is a 2-second exposure for movement of the water. And I just loved the texture in the sky. And that was one of the main elements I wanted to share in this image. So moving up to the 24 to 70 f2.8 art lens, I really love this focal length range because it's so versatile. It captures a wider environment at 24 millimeters, but you can also zoom in for more detail. It's great for giving a real life view as we see it with our eyes, and for that reason, there's very little distortion. So I have a few images I'm going to share with the 24 to 70, and I'll explain my reason for why I chose these particular focal lengths for these scenes. This first capture is just one of the many little cascades in Smoky Mountain National Park that I captured this past October. And I chose the 24-70 for this particular scene at 36 millimeters. For me, I really loved the light that was coming in and the color from the trees in the upper left-hand corner. That little cascade in the middle was definitely a highlight that I wanted to focus on in this particular location. The 36 millimeter was perfect because I feel like the cascade is prominent enough in the scene to be a nice story, but it also allows the light and the color of the upper left side of the frame to come in. Using a really wide angle lens would make that cascade really small and get lost in the frame, where I feel like the viewer's eye would not know where exactly to go. Using a longer focal length, which I did try here, what I found was it zoomed in on the little cascades, but it took out a lot of the light and the color that I felt was adding to the story, being that it was in the autumn. And that light was just really, really beautiful. I also wanted to just note on this one real quick is that this was a 4-second exposure, and I did use a 6-stop neutral density filter in order to slow the shutter speed here. This was also captured this fall, the Sigma 24 to 70. This is actually a local arboretum here outside Chicago. And I went one late afternoon, early evening, and the sun was starting to set. And I was really, really drawn to the shoreline and the way that the golden light was hitting these trees. Some of the leaves had started to fall, as you can tell. Some of the trees are missing some of their leaves, but there was still a lot of pretty color, especially at the top, you know, some of the tops of the trees. And I loved the way the reflection was so beautiful in the water. The 16 millimeters was the perfect choice for what was drawing me to the scene here, as surrounding the scene, there was some blue sky above, which was kind of pretty, but I couldn't get to the very edge of this little pond because there was just a lot of brush, and I don't want to push through, push through the brush and ruin it there. So as close as I could comfortably get, there were a lot of tree branches and twigs that were just very distracting when capturing this with a wider focal length. And I felt like it distracted from what was really calling my eye to the frame, which was the shoreline and the pretty reflection. So I zoomed in to remove the sky and remove the bottom where the shoreline and the twigs were creating a bit of a distraction. Any longer focal length, and I would have started to chop off some of the color that was at the top and then the bottom and the reflection. And I wanted to include that as part of the story. One more with the 24-70. This one is shot at 48 millimeters. This is Morton Overlook in the Smokies. On our first night there, we drove up the parkway and we're hoping for a sunset and weren't sure we were going to get it because it was really overcast and foggy, but took our chances. And as we pulled up to this overlook, we saw the low-lying fog and some of the clouds starting to part. Our jaws just dropped. So I chose the 24-70 and at 48 millimeters, as this really helped to really show the scene as I was seeing it with my eyes. I was able to capture these green trees right here in the foreground that added some depth and interest and then lead with all the fog and clouds all the way out to the sunset. I felt like this was perfect to really tell the story both of the environment and also zoom into what my eye was capturing and seeing.
Hi, Kristen.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. Just a couple quick questions in the chat.
Okay.
And then we are going to have more questions at the end, but I just wanted to bring these up real quick.
Yeah.
If we could only pick one lens, what lens would we use? Would you consider going out with just a wide angle lens and just cropping everything? And why would you not do that?
Well, it depends on how wide. I wouldn't want to go out with only say a 14 and just crop it in just because depending on what the resolution of your camera is and how much you can crop it, you're cutting out pixels. If I absolutely had to choose one, I would probably go with the 24-70, which would be largely because I could get the wide with the 24. And then I could also zoom in at 70.
Okay.
If I really had to choose, that's probably what I would do. And yes, you can crop, and I do crop. I think it just depends on how much you want to crop. So. Yes,
and you do get a little more distortion for sure with the wider the lens.
Right.
Another question that was asked is, how do you decide the shutter speed for these long exposures? I think they were referring to the waterfall.
Oh, okay. So with the little cascade, that one was about 4 seconds. I have a tendency, I kind of play around with my shutter speed with water, whether it's a waterfall or say like the ocean. It depends on kind of the look I'm going for. The longer shutter speed is going to make the water much more silky and smooth. But then sometimes you might want to do, kind of a slow shutter, but where it's going to give more detail in the water, a little bit of detail in the water. So it smooths it out. So I will often shoot for like, waterfalls from like 1 second to 10 and 10 seconds and kind of see what appeals most to me. I don't know if that answers the question with like the beach scene. I had it was 2 seconds. And that of course depends too on how fast your water is moving. But I will play a lot with, if I want to capture some movement and texture in the water from like 0.4 seconds to 5 seconds. And then of course you can do longer for really, really, really smooth, but some of it's just experimenting and seeing what appeals to you.
And I'll ask the last question and then we'll do more at the end. What f-stop, do you decide an f-stop before shooting, or do you take multiple f-stops of the same scene?
Well, it definitely depends on the scene. I try to, generally I'm going to be maybe around f11 as f8 to 11 as a default, but depends if I need more light or if I'm going for a slower shutter speed, then I might know that I'm going to have to close down more. If it's a scene where I have something really close to me, I might need to close down unless I'm going to utilize focus stacking. So it does definitely depend a little bit on various, various factors, like, whether I'm experimenting with shutter speed and whether, whether aperture is the most important of the settings that I'm choosing, I guess, if that makes sense. Sometimes I'm choosing the aperture in order to get a shutter speed in addition to, the depth of field. So they all kind of play in together. So hopefully that makes sense.
Thank you, Kristen.
Yeah, okay. And if there's a further question on that, I can answer it at the end as well. Okay, so I'm going to move on now to the 150 to 600 contemporary lens. I have quite a few images with this, and I've been really excited. The more I use this lens, the more I love it for landscape photography. And I have quite a few images in particular because I feel like it's not necessarily a lens that people would think of for landscape photography. So I have a lot of examples to share. I love it because it zooms in on far off scenes you can't get to with your feet. It isolates details in an otherwise busy scene. It can eliminate boring or distracting elements. Allows you to focus in on shapes, textures, and pockets of light. And it's a really great choice for less than ideal conditions. Before I move on to the first image, I just wanted to also say that with this lens, it is very heavy and large. It definitely really helps to use a tripod when you can to help with any shake, and that's definitely helpful. That said, I do use it handheld quite often. I do use it as well for wildlife, but I love it for landscape scenes. And I have learned that if I'm using it handheld, that I need to up the ISO and to use a shutter speed probably about a minimum of 1/1250, because otherwise I feel like I just shake. So just to keep that in mind. Let's move on to, so this first image is a really great example of the last thing that I mentioned about this lens being great in less than ideal conditions. This particular image was shot last fall in 2019 in Grand Teton National Park on a day that it was just raining and dreary all day long. It was just this pure white sky and rain, and the group we didn't want to just sit around, so we were driving around the park just to see what we could find, and we did find some beauty. This is my favorite image that I captured as we were exploring that day. We ended up by String Lake, and the sky was just white and dreary, but the way the clouds were floating through the trees was really entrancing. And in order to capture what I really wanted to capture in this scene is, the contrast between the soft fog and the textures of the trees and just the lines and diagonals of those. So I used the 150 to 600 here at 300 millimeters. And this is actually one of my favorite images that I captured in that trip. So here's another capture of trees. I love it for capturing trees, actually. This was in the Smokies, and just pulled over it, one of the many overlooks along the parkway. The light had been really beautiful that caused us to pull over, and as I was standing there, I just kind of turning around in circles, just kind of looking for what was drawing me, I noticed this particular branch and how it just kind of curved up and was surrounded by these beautiful fall colors. I chose to use the 150 to 600 and zoom in at 210 because I was really drawn to the branch specifically, and as well below the branch, this actually was a tree that went over the road. And the park was very busy, lots of cars and a lot of distractions beneath it. So zooming in with a longer lens allowed me to have the frame focus on exactly what was calling me to this particular part of nature. So this was also captured last year in 2019 in Grand Teton National Park. This was shot from Oxbow Bend. We had some beautiful, beautiful clouds, and we were standing in the parking lot. I was helping the ladies practice their really long exposures of the clouds over the iconic Oxbow Bend scene. And as I was standing there, I noticed these layers of fall colors and trees on the hillside, as well as the clouds just floating across the peak here. So I quickly just picked up my camera with a 150 to 600 on it and just isolated these particular layers and colors that were drawing my eye. And this was at 260 millimeters. And just a quick note, I'm sure I would have captured this anyway, but right below these yellow trees is the park road. So there's lots of cars going through here, as well as an area of the road where people park in order to shoot at this location. So for example, this year, the same scene was really beautiful, and there's a big RV kind of sitting beneath. So so this is one of those perfect spots where using a longer lens can capture the highlight of the location. As mentioned, I love this lens for capturing the magic of different trees. It can be a great lens for capturing a lone tree, zooming in and getting some compression behind it. Both of these were actually shot at Oxbow Bend as well in different directions. The top one at 550 millimeters was captured it's a little bit in front of Mount Moran, so across the Snake River. As the light was coming over from the east, it lit up this one single tree, and it was just grabbing my eye. And it was really far away from me. So the 150 to 600 was perfect to just, zoom right in on that fall color. And the one below was actually off to the east. So the sun was kind of coming from a little bit behind left of this single green tree that was just grabbing my eye among the mist. This is one of my favorite images that I captured on my family trip to the Tetons this past summer. I'd been out shooting the sunrise, and as I was driving back to the cabin to get my family, I noticed the sunlight was just streaming through these trees on Blacktail Butte. And I kept turning my head, trying to figure out where I could pull over to capture this. So I found a little spot, and I was pretty far away. The foreground between me and these trees was not very interesting. So a wide angle would have had a lot of distractions, and it really wouldn't have told the story of what was capturing my eye. So the 600 millimeters zoomed right in on the pocket of trees that was getting all this beautiful sunlight coming through it. Another one was 600 millimeters. This one was in the Smokies, pulling into Klingman's Dome. We were greeted with lots and lots of fog, some pockets in the valley, but as we were standing there, I looked up at the hillside and noticed all of these empty trees, tree trunks and branches, and I was really drawn to the way both the color of the empty trees, being white, as well as their texture contrasted with the green trees surrounding them. And then again, with the fog and the low clouds coming in with their softness and creating this beautiful atmosphere surrounding them. So the 600 was a perfect focal length to just isolate these the texture and lines and the atmosphere of this particular scene. Here's another different vantage point from the Tetons. This one was captured a couple years ago on it was an evening sunset, and been out shooting the sunset for a little while. There weren't any clouds in the sky that particular night. And for a while I was capturing some of the light that was streaming through some sagebrush in the foreground. I was keeping the mountains pretty high in the frame to eliminate a lot of empty sky. But as the sun went behind the mountains, there was this amazing light that hit the ground, this little triangle of golden light. And so I really wanted to isolate that particular light. So I grabbed the 150 to 600, and I used the 150 millimeter focal length here because that allowed me to also capture the fall colors that were in the foreground. And I love the way the fall color, especially on the left, kind of mirrors the golden light that was hitting the ground. This is a great example. There's a couple more of the Tetons with this longer lens. And it's just a great example of the way the telephoto can really make the mountains feel impressive and large and majestic like they feel in real life. So it is a significant contrast to the really wide angle where you can get a lot of environment and great dramatic skies, but the mountains definitely become smaller in the frame. So it's just something to think about depending on what your story is. This is another little scene from the Smokies. As we drove up the parkway, we stopped at one of the overlooks, and there were just a lot of hillsides, a lot of fog, and it was really pretty. But I wanted to kind of get in on a smaller scene, and this one was captured with 260 millimeters. And I chose this lens in this particular spot as I loved the vertical line of the fall colors coming down through this little crevice between the mountains, and the way the fog created a V in the valley. Here's another, this one is Mount Moran, and this one was captured the day after that really rainy day. We had rain all day. The next morning, finally the clouds were starting to part and light was coming through occasionally and hitting the mountaintops. And as I was driving along to head to one location or another, I noticed the way the clouds were parting over the tip of Mount Moran and the sun was hitting the top. So I used 280 millimeters here so I could isolate the peak to get the top sky and the clouds below and really show the way the sun was bringing out the texture of the mountaintop and the fresh snow that was on top of it as well. So this is just a great example to really, show textures and a pocket of light. This is an image that I definitely wouldn't have been able to capture the same way if I had not had my 150 to 600 with me. I'd been out shooting a local sunrise, and it was a misty, sunny morning. And as I left, I looked in my rear view mirror and I noticed these light rays just coming through the trees. And at first there really wasn't anywhere to stop, but I noticed a little pullout on the side of the road. And fortunately there really wasn't any traffic because it was still pretty early in the morning. So I just kind of pulled over and jumped out and captured this with my 600 millimeters lens. If I'd used a wider angle, it really would have just had a lot of road leading to these light rays, and the story really wouldn't have been the same. There would have been too much environment and it wouldn't have really highlighted what was drawing my eye to the scene. Here's another example with 150 millimeters where the story that I really wanted to show in this particular image was the Grand Teton and its really impressive nature, the texture of the rock and the bit of fall foliage that sat beneath them. And it's just a great example of how the telephoto really brings those mountains closer and makes them feel as impressive in an image as they're, as they are in real life. This one was captured last February, and this was a beautiful cold morning in along the Grovant River. The light was just streaming through these frosty trees. It was a pretty clear day, so there wasn't a cloud in the sky, but the light was just really, really pretty. Clouds and mist floating up from the water. And I just wanted to isolate these particular trees, the way the snow was clinging to them. So I used 400 millimeters here. This one is captured with 230 millimeters. As I was driving through the park road this past fall, I was just blown away. My jaw dropped as I was watching the light that was coming and hitting the peaks and the clouds floating over, that I had to pull over at this one of the lookouts. And the foreground wasn't really the story that was calling to me, but it was just the way the dramatic clouds were floating over the peaks and the way the light was creating different little pockets and highlighting the texture of the mountains. So again, I really love how the 150 to 600 can allow me to capture certain details and the nice texture and zoom in on these areas that we can't get to with our feet. So now I'm going to show you just a few areas, a few locations where I captured images with various focal lengths. So it can show how you can capture different images in the same location using different lenses and focal lengths, and just how they tell a different story. So this is a hillside overlooking the Tetons. You can see them in the distance. And this one is with 14 millimeters. So you can see that it captures such a nice wide environment. There's a nice line at the hillside leading the eye from left to right and over to the Tetons, as well as I was able to capture the sunburst up on the left side of the frame. Using a longer focal length, I definitely wouldn't have been able to capture that sun. But you can also see how the Tetons are smaller in the frame. So if you really want to capture the grandeur of the mountains, the 14 isn't telling that story as strong as a longer lens will do. So this is that same location as the sun had started to set and the clouds were picking up the color. And these are both with the 150 to 600. I was really drawn to the light on the hillside, the layers, the way the light and shadow played along these, the hill leading up to Mount Moran. And you can see how these longer focal lengths really brought Moran much closer in view. And these are 3 more images captured from the same location. The one on the left is 500 millimeters. Just as the sunset light, the clouds were floating just over the tip of the Grand and the light was lighting up that left side. So I wanted to zoom in and capture that texture and that light. The top right is 150 millimeters again, and you can see how it really brings the mountains close and shows their, how impressive they are. It's a stark contrast to the 14. And then for a mid view, we have the 62 millimeters down on the bottom right, which brings the mountains a little bit more impressive and makes them a stronger subject in the frame, but also includes some of the foreground and the trees and the hillside. So there's several different images just from this one location using various focal lengths. These two are significant contrast to each other. The image on the top I shared earlier in the presentation. These are both captured at String Lake. The top one, as I mentioned earlier, is captured with 14 millimeter in order to capture the mountains, the reflection, and the sky. And this image on the bottom right was taken with 150 millimeters, because I wanted to focus in on the smaller scene of just the way the rocks and the trees were reflecting the water. So I have 3 images captured from Newfound Gap in Smoky Mountain National Park. So after an uneventful sunrise, the clouds began to part and these beautiful rays were coming over the mountains in the distance. So these 2 images on the right, one was captured with 70mm focal length with a 24-70, and the one on the bottom was captured at 150mm with the 150-600. And I love both of the images, but I think they tell different stories. With the top image at 70mm, it really shows a lot more of the environment. And for me, looking at this image in retrospect, I feel like the story, it tells more a story of the whole environment, the hillside with the fall colors and the road that was coming through. And the light rays in the distance are more of a supporting element as opposed to the main subject. In the bottom image, 150, I really feel like the light rays, because we're zooming in and getting more of the mountains, those take center stage in this particular image. From the same location, I shot this image with the 150-600 at 600mm. I was really drawn to the curve of the road and the fall colors surrounding it. So I set this one up on my tripod and just waited until one single car came along the road. So those are very, they're different images captured with different focal lengths, standing in the same place. And 3 more images captured along the parkway with different focal lengths. This was captured, and these were in the same location as that fall color curved tree that I shared a little bit earlier. So looking at the one on the bottom right is 24mm with a 24-70. And I was really drawn to the way the light was just streaming down the hillside and lighting up all the fall colors. So this one shows a little bit more environment, and I really like this image, but the way the sun was sitting behind those clouds and making some of the clouds really bright, I found to be a little bit distracting, even avoiding too many bright highlights. So I used this 24-70 at 62mm for the image above it, and just took out that sky and allowed the image to really focus on the fall foliage and the colors and the way the light was illuminating the trees. On the flip side, on the left side, you can see this vertical image. I shot this with the 150 at 220mm. And the reason I chose this particular frame is I loved the way that the yellow trees were creating a diagonal from lower left up to the upper right. And if you look over, particularly in the 62mm shot, you can kind of see in the right corner, you can see the diagonal of those yellow trees. So this is just a great example, I think, of how capturing the same scene with different focal lengths can really tell a bit of a different story and show different highlights in the frame. So in conclusion, lens choice plays a big role in capturing your creative vision and how you tell your story. In addition, using multiple lenses and focal lengths can open up your creativity and allow you to capture multiple unique and different images from the same location. And then I have the 3 lenses I used for these images listed here in case you wanted to make a note. I love all 3 images for lenses for different reasons. And I love the way they allow me to capture different stories in my images. So that's it. Thank you. Happy to answer any questions that anyone has.
Hey, thank you, Kristen. I was trying to type in the chat. There was a lot of questions, so sorry if I didn't answer. Some of you I was answering directly, so let me run through a couple. Bear with me, there are a few here. So
yeah, I
want to not get out of context here. Lots of great images. Does Kristen backpack on any or all of these off-road trips?
Most of them are off-road. I don't do a ton of backpacking right now, although I'd like to do more. But most of them are off-road. Some of them are hiking places, but Most of them are they're not a trek.
David says you have an interesting take on your lens workflow. Do you carry one body for the wide and one for the tele?
I do. Yeah, I usually carry 2 bodies, and I often have my 150 to 600 on my Z6. They make a great pair. It's but yes, I always have 2 bodies, and I usually have a wide angle on one, and the Z6 usually has my 150 to 600.
What about autofocus? Sharon B's asking, are you using autofocus for these?
Sometimes it depends on the scene, depends on the light. Sometimes I'll autofocus, but check it and tweak it if needed.
Okay. Chris is asking, you're often at f5.6 to f11. Do you prefer not to stop down to f16?
I think I don't necessarily not stop down when I need to. I do think with the 150 to 600, I probably, because for example, if I'm hand holding, then I probably do end up opening up my aperture a little bit more in order to get a faster shutter speed. A faster shutter speed. But I will absolutely close down if I need to.
Yeah, and we'll ask this question in a minute. We're going to do a trivia question, so hang in there. I see so many thank yous that are coming to you of people that absolutely loved the class.
Oh,
I'm scrolling through all these, but do you shoot full manual or typically shoot a different mode like aperture priority? And what are your take on auto ISO?
I usually shoot in full manual. However, sometimes I might choose to use aperture mode depending on if the light's consistently changing. It depends on what I'm doing. I don't do a lot of long exposure work with the 150 to 600, but sometimes with like, especially the 24-70, I do a lot of long exposure. If the opportunity is there, whether it's clouds or water. And in those cases, I feel like I need to be in complete control of all my settings myself.
Mm-hmm.
And I usually set my ISO. I don't necessarily think there's anything wrong with using auto ISO as long as you are paying attention that it's not setting it higher than you want it to be.
And somebody's asking, with some of the times you are using higher ISO, are you preferring, or do you often find yourself hand holding with this lens, or are usually on a tripod?
I prefer to use a tripod, but I will definitely handheld and hand hold, I should say. It really depends on the scene. Sometimes I find it easier to hand hold in certain situations, or like a couple, I'm jumping out of the car, and like one I was just on the side of the road, I really couldn't set up the tripod. So it depends on this. It depends on the situation, but a lot of times I will not hesitate to raise my ISO in order to have a higher shutter speed if need be. And if I can set up the tripod, I will, but I don't hesitate to shoot a handheld either. I'd rather get the shot that I want. So yeah.
And one common question I'm getting in the chat, one common question I'm getting in the chat is about the 14 to 24 DG and the 14 to 24 DG DN. And I'll answer this one. If it says DG, it's full frame. And if it says DG DN, DN stands for digital neo. That would mean it's for the mirrorless camera. We currently make that lens in E mount and L mount. So if you have a Sony or a Sigma FP or Panasonic, that would be the L mount, and the Sony would be the E mount. And someone asked, which will it work on the R5? We don't currently make an RF mount, but we do make a Canon EF mount for the DSLR. Our lenses are digital, are firmware, so you can pop that on a Canon RF with their adaptive Canon lenses. Long explanation, but let me get to one other one. Okay, we got so many here. 14 millimeter for astrophotography. Do you stop it down, or do you use the widest aperture?
I usually will use 1.8.
Okay.
1.8 or 2. I mean, generally I will go ahead and use the widest aperture. I mean, it does depends on where you are. I mean, if it's really, really dark, then I definitely am going to be at the widest.
Well, I think we're at the end of it. Someone asked, did we make a lens for the Canon 70D? Yes, the 18 to 35. Anytime you see the denoted as DC, that means it's for the crop sensor. So look for the focal length, DC for crop, DG for full frame. So 18 to 300, 18 to 35, and we have a 30 millimeter prime for that 70D, any crop sensor camera. And I think we will go with our trivia question, because I have something called a holiday gift certificate from Sigma.
Maybe Kristen can stop her screen share so we can kind of see each other.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
That's how exciting this is.
That's good. Thank you.
I don't know, Rui, do you want to jump in on this too, or do you want me to be hyping this up? Or
Yeah, you can hype it up. You can put the question in.
okay, I'm going to put the question in, and I will say in advance, this is going to be the first one to answer the question. So if you're in the chat and you're ready to hit that return key when we ask this question, and this question I'm about to ask, okay? Question I'm about to ask, I hope you're paying attention here. Great class, Kristen. Which national park did Kristen fall in love with landscape photography? And we're looking at the track. Whoa!
Oh,
The chat. Whoa! I feel like a YouTuber right now.
All right, we've got.
Oh, I can't even see. We're gonna see. Rui's gonna
got
be
Maya. Maya was the first.
Wow, that was incredible. Yay!
Yay, go Maya. So Maya needs to send me something in the chat, just privately, her email or phone number, whatever she wants, so I can reach out to her and get her that gift card.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good job.
That's
Those are
great.
quick fingers.
I'm actually looking forward to going there with Kristen when she offers the
Oh, great.
that's gonna be a treat for myself.
Oh, yay.
Where are you located, Maya?
I'm in Pasadena.
Oh, wonderful. Well,
Yeah.
thanks for being here. Congratulations.
Thank you.
There are a plethora of questions here still, some for me. In general, I don't know how much time we'll leave this on for a short time so we can gather this information. We are at the end, but let's see if I have any more for you, Kristen, real quick. On the shots with the reflective water, do you use a polarizing filter? And I know you talked about it a little bit. How often do you work with polarizing filters?
I do use polarizing filters most often with like the 24-70 range. You have to, with skies, you got to be careful with really wide angles because you get, inconsistent polarizing effect. But yeah, with that mid-range, I use polarizers quite often. And I love the, I will also use with like waterfalls and stuff, Breakthrough Photography filter, they have, it's a dark polarizing filter that I love to use because it gives me like a 6-stop plus the polarizing.
And with neutral density, how often, kind of related, do you use the neutral density filters versus?
Versus what?
Versus the polarizing, I guess.
Oh, well, it depends on the scene. The waterfalls, for example, that's one situation where, like, if I want a polarizing effect as well as to be able to slow my shutter speed, I love that dark polarizer. It's because it adds 6 stops or takes away 6 stops as well. But yeah, it depends on the particular scene, but I love to shoot with, I love to slow my shutter speed, whether it's for clouds or water. So I definitely always have a polarizer as well as a 6-stop and 10-stop in my bag.
Okay.
We also had a question is when your next Grand Teton workshop is going to be.
Oh, well, so I have 3 retreats next year that are currently sold out, but I do have a wait list. They all got rescheduled from this year. So most almost all of the women that were signed up for this year deferred their spots to next year. But again, I have a wait list, and I'll do them again in 2022, but they're scheduled for June and then September. So
Great.
Yeah.
All right.
And someone asked, and do you have a lot of noise at ISO 200, at ISO 2000? How do you not have much noise in your photos?
Well, one of the things I definitely try to do if I'm raising my ISO is to make sure that my exposure is as far to the right without blown highlights as possible. The better exposure you get, the less noise you'll have. So the worst thing is to shoot with a high ISO and then underexpose, because then you get raising the shadows will just create more noise in addition to the ISO. So I do my best to get the best exposure that I can whenever I have to raise the ISO.
Okay. And gosh, there's just so many questions here still.
Let's take like 2 more questions, and then we're gonna get ready for our next class.
Okay, one question for landscape photography. Would you rather have the Sigma 24 to 105 f4 or the 24 to 70 f2.8?
Goodness. Well, I think if you only want to have one lens to say carry traveling or hiking, then you might want to have the more extensive focal length range. If you're going to be shooting with it in low light, then you might
you want
to use it for night photography as well. Say for astrophotography, then you would really want the f2.8. I have not used the 24 to 105, so just in terms of one lens versus the other lens, I can't compare that personally. But as far as just the focal length range and the aperture, I think if you do want to also use it, say for astrophotography, then the f2.8 is going to be a big deal.
Okay, and I'll answer just one question to a cine enthusiast. Yes, we do sell Sigma cine lenses at Samys. They range from 3,500 to 5,500, top of the line stuff, and they do make E-mount cine kits, and I believe Samys does sell neutral density filters as well. Sorry, I can't add you the link about the lenses for the 70D in this checks will be exiting, but if I can just leave you to denote the 18 to 35 f1.8 is the fastest crop sensor zoom lens, or the 30 millimeter prime f1.4. I will leave it to Rui to close us out, and I want to say thank you to Samys and Kristen personally, and I'll hand it over to you, Rui.
Thank you so much, Kristen. Mike, really had a great time. I think everyone enjoyed this presentation very much. Remember that we are open in our locations in Los Angeles, Santa Ana, Pasadena. We're doing rentals up in San Francisco. So again, stores are open. If you want to do curbside pickup, we can do that. And we're also online. So thank you so much for your support of Samys. Great to see you. We've got 2 more classes coming up. We have Holiday Children Portraits, and that's coming at 2 p.m. And then we also have the Wonderful Waterfall class that's coming up at 4 p.m. Those are all Pacific time, LA time. And if you want a link to those, sign up on our website at samysphotoSchool.com. So thanks again. And if you're coming back at 2 o'clock, see you in less than an hour.
Thank you.
All right, take care. Thank you.